For Pride Month, I'm making a series of videos about why some Christians need to change their minds about the LGBT community. And so there's a few separate questions that come up here, but I think the most pressing and sort of central question is, what do we do with the Bible verses that talk about homosexuality? And how do those verses affect the way that we see and interact people who are in relationships that aren't traditional? People who are in relationships that if we are raised in a conservative Christian background, may not think are moral because of our beliefs about what the Bible says. Often, when approaching this question, a lot of Christians show up with this thought process that we don't need to have a conversation about whether or not the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. They come to this question thinking this is clear. That's actually where I started. I went to a Christian college. I studied the Bible in college. I went on to seminary. I've worked for conservative churches. And that whole time I had sort of two things happening inside of me. One is maybe it's my age or my generation or just my experiences, but I've never been bothered by the idea or the concept of, say, two men in a relationship or two women in a relationship. And so when thinking about these issues, my gut says, this doesn't bother me. But my theology says, hey, this is immoral, and it's immoral in a way that is very serious. And so I lived with this tension where my gut and my theology were at odds with each other. And the way that I handled that, and I think the way that many other Christians handle that, is to simply not push on it, to set it aside. And if someone were to say, well, what do you think about some of these modern issues, right? We just recently had gay marriage legalized. So while that was going on, if someone were to say, well, what do you think about this? I would sort of remove myself from the equation and shrug it off with sort of an apologetic, yeah, I that's what the Bible says. This is wrong because the Bible says it. I want to love people. I want to be kind, but the Bible says it. And in doing so, what I was doing internally was I was saying, it's the Bible that says this. It's not me that says this. And so I was solving that internal tension by putting the responsibility for what I believed outside of myself. The reason I'm making this video is because I think a lot of Christians are doing that. They are putting the responsibility for what they believe outside of themselves. And the reality is that's just not how biblical interpretation works. If you're a Christian who loves Jesus and wants to be faithful in the way that they live, that is not how you interpret the Bible. Let me give you an example. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the statements that he makes is that a Christian should loan without expecting anything in return. Now, the church I grew up in used a lot of material that was created by Dave Ramsey and his organizations. And so if we wanted to learn how to biblically manage finances, our go-to material was Dave Ramsey material. Well, just recently, Dave Ramsey made a small stir because he defended that it was not against his faith to evict people who were not able to pay their rent during the pandemic. Now, what's interesting here is if you agree with that, if you have respect for this man, his actions go directly against the words of Jesus, right? He is loaning someone a home, and he is expecting repayment, and when he doesn't get that, he is making a choice. Now, the point here is not whether the man is right or wrong. I think it's a good example because the first thing that sort of happens when you hear that example is you begin to think about reasons why it is okay for a landlord to expect a monthly rent check even if they're a Christian. So what we've begun to do is the work of interpretation. We've seen something in the Bible that seems straightforward and clear, but we recognize that it does not apply directly to life. And so we begin to do the work of interpretation. And this is with everything the Bible says. Anything that we would say the Bible is very clear on, we need to check what we are trying to say. Another go-to example is murder. I think we all agree, murder is wrong. The Bible says murder is wrong. No one's arguing about that. But the question becomes, what constitutes murder? If someone breaks into your home and in the act of defending yourself, you kill someone, is that murder? If you a desire to serve your country, join the military, and the military puts you in some sort of assignment where you have to kill another person, is that murder? See, again, we take something straightforward and we begin to do the work of interpretation. And so the very first thing, before we can have any sort of conversation about LGBT people and their role in the church, and what we do with who they're attracted to, how we communicate to them, what we say is right and what we say is wrong. So we have to look at these verses that we are assuming are clear and ask ourselves, what are these actually saying? I think it's important to point out that when we're dealing with homosexuality specifically, we're dealing with 6 verses. 6. If I wanted to talk about money, right? We use the Dave Ramsey example. If I wanted to talk about money, we'd be working with around 300 verses. And a lot of those verses are very clear. They say things like sell your possessions and give to the poor. That's a direct command. They say things like don't wear gold jewelry. That's a direct command. It's very clear. But I said those too because you probably don't think that those are direct commands for you today, because we don't practice those. And in the same way, when we're dealing with these 6 verses, we have to recognize that 6 verses are inherently ambiguous. Inherently ambiguous because the world that the Bible is written in does not have a category called homosexuality. So no one is talking about it, no one is thinking about it. They talk and think about sex very differently than we talk and think about sex. There are not gay couples in the ancient world who want to be treated with the dignity that straight couples are treated with. So whenever this idea comes up, we have to be aware that the Bible is talking about something different than we are talking about. The Bible starts from this place where Paul doesn't even have a word for what he's trying to communicate when he talks about homosexuality. He invents a word. The word that gets translated homosexuality occurs nowhere but in the writings of Paul. I'll get into all of that later. What I'm hoping you are thinking today as you hear me say this is that maybe when you have come to these texts and you have assumed in the past that the words of the Bible exclude all homosexual relationships from the life of the church, which is to say that the Bible says they are immoral, de facto immoral in any situation, I hope what you begin to think is, am I sure? Am I sure that the Bible says that? Am I sure? Because I think that a lot of us shouldn't be sure. We've never looked into it. We've never asked these questions. The thing I just said about homosexuality being a made-up word, you probably have never heard that before. Maybe you have. I don't know your experience. I don't know the research you've done. But when I began to do the research, my opinion began to change. My opinion about how the Bible talks about sexuality changed. My opinion about how the Bible talks about morality changed. My opinion about God changed. And in the end, I came to realize that God has designed LGBT people the way he has designed them, and that the church should extend to their relationships the same honor and dignity that it extends to straight relationships. I understand you might not agree with me, and I'm not asking you to accept what I'm saying on faith. I'm asking you to let this month be a month where you go on a journey where you actually investigate the question. And I ask that you follow the videos that I put out, because I'm going to argue for that point. I'm going to show you the things that changed my mind. And I encourage you to let it bother you and to do the research. And at the end of the month, if you still disagree with me, I hope that you will disagree with me for good reasons, for well thought out reasons, not because you assume the Bible is clear. And I'm going to push on you just a little harder here, because if you think this question isn't worth asking, I think you are in danger of hurting people in your life, friends, family, neighbors, because you are not being thoughtful with your theology. And even if we don't agree at the end of this, I bet that your study of this topic will lead you to conclusions where you will have stronger opinions about how to love gay people in your life, lesbian people in your life, bisexual or transgender people, or anything else in the spectrum of human sexuality. When you encounter those people, I bet that just the study alone will show you how to love them better, even if you cannot affirm their life choices. And at the end of the day, if you don't feel like loving people better, you are not following Jesus. So I hope you join me. Have a good day.